Hi everyone, hope you're all well. Just before I get into the main subject of the video, today is an important anniversary, the 80th um, anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Probably it's not as high profile as the 75th, because three-quarters of a century tend to be, that tends to be a bigger landmark. But still, it's 80 years ago today, December 7th, a date which shall live in infamy. President Biden was at the site, and apparently, in his wreath, there was the wild sunflower, state flower of Kansas, and this was in homage to the late Senator Bob Dole. I've been thinking a bit about Dole recently because, of course, he's passed away at 98. He was a World War II veteran um, who lost to Bill Clinton in 1996, long-serving senator. This has been quite a year for big names in American politics to pass away. I mean, off the top of my head, George Shultz, Donald Rumsfeld, Colin Powell, Walter Mondale, another presidential candidate, and now Bob Dole, all have passed away this year. Anyway, I am going to be talking a little bit about American history in this video because I think the issues are important, and I think a lot of them spill over to this side of the Atlantic. Now, let's be very clear, the history of race relations in the United States and the history of race relations in the UK are not one and the same. Both countries have had problems. I'd say the US much deeper so, but we are certainly not, we cannot say we've had a history of complete harmony either, far from it. Um, but I just want to look at this a little bit because it seems to me that, every country in the world has at least one issue that is really, really taboo. Now, there's a lot going on in the world at the moment. I think the pandemic's affecting everyone, and I think that issues around the pandemic, to mask, to not mask, restrictions, vaccines, and so on, those debates are in every country. So that's not something that's unique to any country. Um, if we look at sensitive issues around the world, the monarchy, very sensitive in Thailand. In a country like Pakistan, it's blasphemy. There's just been an appalling incident in the city of Tilkot. Uh, Lankan man has been lynched. Um, I could easily make a video about that, but I've done it before, and you could drain yourself of the sort of negative news. But those are sensitive issues around the world. In the US, probably guns, abortion, but I think nothing more so than race. Um, I think race in America is just such a powder keg. And that's unfortunate, but it's also understandable given America's history. Um, and, this is something I have looked at quite extensively because it's the history of the world's most powerful country. Um, and I think over the last year, particularly with the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, protests, riots last year, I think all three um, words could be linked to BLM. And a lot of other issues going on. There's this, it's as volatile as ever. And that's a sad thing because the United States has had periods where there really did seem to be an improvement and a period of optimism. I would say probably post 1980s up until probably the mid 2010s, things had improved. I think that by that point, most of the issues around segregation, Jim Crow, all that sort of stuff was the past. And I think that there were, what we've seen in the past 10 years, the urban unrest and so on, nothing like that has been seen since the 1992 Los Angeles riots. So there was a period of relative, and I say relative here because I know it's never been perfect, but relative stability in the United States in terms of race relations. I'd say from roughly 1992 to probably the Ferguson riot of 2015, roughly speaking. There were probably incidents in between that, but you know, it's a period of relative stability. Now it seems that history has just gone back. It seems that a lot of the progress that has been made has been reversed, or at least something has changed. And I think of the quote by the black conservative commentator Thomas Sowell, or Thomas Sowell, Sewell, yeah, who said that racism is not dead, but it's kept on life support. And he was saying that that is at the hands of race baiters. And I think he was partly right. I know what he meant, namely that issues that shouldn't have anything to do with race are exacerbated into racial issues by people pushing an agenda. I do think that the way powerful media outlets like CNN handle race are, for the most part, pretty awful. I think they do more harm than good. And they will say, well, we have to cover these things. But my question is, well, how are you covering them? Are you being consistent? I um I come from a centrist point of view. In the States, I'd be a moderate. And I sort of think that both sides are wrong in their approach. So let me just start with a critique of the conservative side of things. I do think there's a little bit of denial about history on the conservative side. I mean, it is appalling that well into the 20th century, all a black man had to do was look at a white woman the wrong way and he would be barbarically lynched in public. Now, this was the United States. There was an awful incident in Waco, Texas, 1916. Young black man, teenager, Jesse Washington. It was known as the Waco Horror. They didn't just kill him; they tortured the guy publicly. Now, the Emmett Till case is famous, but that was by that time lynching was starting to die out, and it was the mid 50s. That was a point where he was abducted by Klansmen in the middle of the night. It wasn't. There was something I found particularly sickening, seeing those images of public lynchings. This year, 2021 marked the centenary of the Tulsa race riot in Oklahoma, which has acclaimed being possibly the worst act of racial violence in American history. Some other examples, the East St. Louis riot of 1917 was also had a similar sort of death toll. Um, so I think sometimes conservatives don't want to acknowledge that there was a very dark past there. But the question is, how is it acknowledged? Is it a case of reopening old wounds or just acknowledging the past? I feel that it should be a case of acknowledging the past. We've had similar debates in the UK about, the crimes of the British Empire, the role of transatlantic slavery, and so on. Now, I'm pleased to say Sheffield City Council recently refused demands to change street names because of its connections to the slave trade. And I say I'm pleased because A, it wouldn't have been democratic. The majority of residents were against the change. Secondly, I don't think you teach history by erasing it. Just pretending, just trying to have this purification of anything that's connected to a negative part of history, I think is misguided. In the States, the Confederate statues, well, they were put up in the segregationist era as opposed to just after the Civil War. I've just read today that the statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville is going to be melted down. That might be a bit different because they were put up in the segregationist era. But I think the great tragedy about the United States is this is such a sensitive issue that critical thinking has been lost. So, as an example, if a black guy and a white guy, or a black person and a white person, women as well, in that sort of situation, there will be people who will insist that race is always a factor. They won't consider maybe these are just two people who don't like each other. Maybe they have a personal history. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding. And I think that, if you are a public figure in the United States and you end up on the wrong side of a story on race, it's just a powder keg. I was reading last night about an incident on the New York City subway in 1984, and I forget the guy's name, but he was a white Jewish guy, and he shot four black teenagers. He said they were trying to mug him, and again, race came up. He was supported on one hand as being an example of a New Yorker long fed up with crime, you know, snapping and defending himself. Others said he was a racist vigilante. Um, but that sort of mentality sadly hasn't gone away, whereby people just jump to conclusions without knowing all the facts. It happened earlier this year, the mass shooting at the Asian spa in Atlanta, in the suburb of Atlanta. Because most of the victims were Asian, it was immediately labeled a hate crime. And major media networks were doing precious little to point out that that hadn't been designated at that point because the government's intentions were not known. And he said himself that it wasn't racially motivated. I actually think that attack was more misogynistic. I think it was more an attack on sex workers. Two of his victims, I understand, were white. But this is the tragedy with the United States. Whenever race is involved, it's a powder keg. So I think the Conservatives are a little bit in denial about the fairly recent past. I mean, that isn't the Dark Ages, but it is getting further back in time now. I think they're a little bit in denial about it, but more to the point, I think they also want to pretend that the situation's perfect today, and it's not. It's really not. Um, I recently drew attention to the Anthony Broadwater case, I mean, on my channel, and, black man served 16 years for a crime he didn't commit, was charged with raping the writer Alice Sebold. Now, he was exonerated. There have been so many African American men who have been innocent. Probably some white and Hispanic men as well. I think there's a serious problem in the American justice system. But I think it would be wrong to say that African American men haven't been affected in that way. Now, you could make the argument that in big cities like St. Louis and Chicago and Baltimore, there is a severe problem of black on black crime. That's true as well in the UK, in London and Birmingham. I think the likes of Black Lives Matter haven't done anywhere near enough to address that and be honest about it. And incidentally, most of those cities are run by the Democrats. So again, the Democrats really, have to be careful when they're lecturing about crime. Um, Nevertheless, I think it would be wrong to say that there are no issues facing black Americans. I think it would be wrong for conservatives to say, well, there's no racism, because there is. When you get um, white women who are harassing a black guy because he's jogging, I mean, there is definitely racist attitudes out there. And sure, there's racism across the board. There is also racism against white people. Not in the same way necessarily. I'm talking about attitudes as opposed to. Um, but I think that's my critique of the right. They don't fully acknowledge some of the issues that go on. Police brutality, well, there's white victims of police brutality as well. And there are also cases where black suspects are armed and the police are protecting themselves. But there are too many examples also of police brutality. But again, because race is a powder keg in the States, people don't bother to check, even if you have a black officer shooting a black man, oh, well, still racist police. So the narrative gets spun without people bothering to check the facts. The Kyle Rittenhouse trial is another example. I always felt with that, I wasn't comfortable with the idea of a 17-year-old going around with a firearm, basically acting as a vigilante, and I don't really like the way the right eulogized Rittenhouse. At the same time, he was attacked. Probably the verdict was justified in that context. Um, but again, even the president, and I think Biden absolutely needs to apologize for that, saying that Rittenhouse was a white supremacist. No evidence for it. No evidence at all. And this sort of reckless narrative is so toxic. And this is where I come to the left. Getting back to Thomas Sowell's comment about racism isn't dead but it's kept on life support. I think the left have a lot to answer for in terms of race baiting. it is the left that is promoting critical race theory. Now, I've nothing against school children learning about America's history, about Jim Crow, about segregation, about slavery, about those issues because it is part of American history. What I have a big problem with is this idea that you build bridges and you move forward by telling white children that they are perpetual oppressors and telling black children that they are constantly oppressed. Because what sort of narrative does this send out? And I think that left wing academics like Peggy McIntosh, she coined the term white privilege. I think they're utterly lamentable. They have so much to answer for in terms of the toxicity and the divisions that, in my opinion, their narrative has largely caused. This is not to say that America doesn't have problems, but I do think the problems are exacerbated by reckless language, by making everything about race. And instead of moving on in the vision that Martin Luther King had, constantly trying to deepen those wedges by promoting victimhood narrative. So I think reasonable Americans really need to be bold and courageous and speak out for common sense, whether they be white or black or Hispanic or Asian. They need to speak out for common sense. Every time there's a confrontation between a white person and a black person doesn't mean that race is a motivation. Every time a black person um, suffers an injustice doesn't mean that there is definitely racism as a component, or rather, even if they suffer a disappointment. I think there are issues to address. I think that there are double standards in the justice system. I mean, let's be honest, a poor black woman who is accused of a crime is probably going to get a harsher sentence than a middle class white woman. That's a reality. And I don't think anyone can rationally say it isn't. So there are issues that need to be addressed. But when you talk about white privilege, what does that do? All that does is polarize poor white Americans who are really struggling. And some of the poverty in states like Arkansas and West Virginia, white poverty I'm talking about, is absolutely appalling. It could almost rival things that are seen in developing countries, and this is in the United States of America. So when these left wing academics speak about white privilege in such a casual way, or when you get intolerant woke activists and woke ideologues, they talk about respect and they talk about the need to be compassionate and an understanding society, but then they literally laugh when their bigotry is brought up. When their narrative, it's pointed out that that is not helping matters. Double standards don't help. I mean, I've seen, for example, comedy sketches from the likes of BuzzFeed. And the thing is, it would be fine to look at it as comedy. It's poking how white people, for example, see minorities. That could be seen as, okay, it's biting edge humor if it was only consistent. But the likes of BuzzFeed, they only focus on white people because no one else can be racist according to BuzzFeed. So it'll be something that how white people see Asians, how white guys have yellow fever, and it's constantly this focus of the white oppressor. And if you're modeling that as humor, fine, but just be consistent. Make fun of everyone. I'll give Family Guy its due, the cartoon Family Guy. They could be crude at times, and sometimes Family Guy was in bad taste. One thing about Family Guy, though, it really was utilitarian in the sense that it had to go with everyone. Everyone. White Americans, Italian Americans, Asian Americans, Black Americans. It was all there. So no one could accuse Family Guy of being racist because it was consistent. And I think that's the thing that's missing in the States. Um, it concerns me because this spills over to this side of the Atlantic. We've had the ELM rallies, we've had the same sort of narrative coming into our universities about white privilege and so on. And I think it's toxic. What's wrong with saying, look, this is issues that the black community faces without shaming the entire white community or without, assuming that you know the individual circumstances of every white person. That's the problem with something like white privilege. It's generalizing. And its proponents say, oh no, we're not demonizing white people. That's exactly what you're doing. Because you're saying that everyone of a demographic is one and the same, that they are all privileged. Privilege has a very specific meaning. It means undue perks. That's what it means. So it just saddens and frustrates me that this issue is so toxic. And one misunderstanding could, spiral into something much, much bigger. In fact, Family Guy had a skit a few years ago. If you know the show, the character Cleveland, who's black, his son was shot by Peter Griffin, who's white, and there was a huge thing in that. But in the end, he said, "Oh, I shot my son," and he didn't. But he was making the point that the media don't care about black on black crime. I mean, where's CNN's reports on the level of violence in Democrat-run cities? I think CNN's a good example, but there's others. When double standards are practiced, it all that does is deepen divides. So when the New York Times employs someone like Sarah Jong, who's Korean American, and she makes racist rants about white people, she claimed she was only targeting conservatives, but it was very obvious what she was saying. She keeps her job. Yet you get others, white people who've come out with racist statements and they lose their job. Let's just not have double standards. Um, I actually think most Americans, like most British people, just want to get on with their lives and they're not interested in these sort of culture wars. But the problem is those who are pushing it, those who are pushing the divide, are vocal and influential. I mean, Joe Biden, I think, comes from a relatively moderate background. I don't think he's particularly radical. The problem is, within his party, the woke left is so powerful and influential that Biden has to pander to them quite a bit. So does Kamala Harris. I actually think Biden and Harris are relatively centrist, but I think that they pander to the woke left of the party, and that's a problem. Because so long as you have Trump on the Republican side of things, he still dominates that conversation because he's playing this game whereby he won't commit to running in 2024, but he probably will. Therefore, no moderate Republican's going to run because they know they won't get the votes. So, unfortunately, America's divides are going to continue, and unfortunately, a lot of that is racial. I think part of the problem is the way news networks and even the political parties they look about the whites, the Asians, the Italian Americans, as if everyone thinks the same, as if every Hispanic American thinks alike, as if every white American thinks alike. This is one of the most egregious causes for divide in the states, in my opinion. And I know that there are perhaps certain areas whereby it makes sense to look at a particular demographic geographically for sure. I mean, naturally in California and Texas and Arizona, there's going to be more focus on Hispanic Americans. Um, in Baltimore and Washington, D.C., it's going to be Black Americans. So there's that. But again, identity politics, I think, causes a lot more harm than good. It forces people into a defensive. And if people feel that they're victims, they're going to lash out, they're going to be angry. This is why I think critical race theory is poison. Because if you're telling young minds you're white, therefore you're an oppressor, and your friend's black and he's being oppressed, what does that do for the future? I think conservatives have to acknowledge that there are issues that need to be addressed, but I think the left go far too far in terms of how they cover this stuff, in terms of how they address it. And when they get into the realm of microaggressions and cultural appropriation and all these buzzwords they love to use to control people's lives, um, I think it just deepens the divide. And it's also an attack on liberty and incidentally on the issue of cultural appropriation. If someone wants to dress a certain way, that's entirely their own business. I just think it's sad the extent to which dominates discourse in American life. And I think there's a lot of people that are actually reasonable. You know, they don't spend all the time thinking about race, but it's such a toxic issue that when something happens, when a black teenager is shot by a white man, or when you know, you have a white woman who alleges rape against a black man, and you have sort of situations, and those are loose examples. There's many other situations. Unfortunately, so much focus is put on this defensive attitude, or this accusation. What's the right word? This finger pointing attitude, rather than just stepping back a little bit and thinking, let's look at the facts of this case on its own, on its own. And this is not to say that race is never a factor. I believe sometimes it is, but so often we see these viral videos where supposedly there's some racial incident going on, and actually that may not be part of it. And then you get these shameless people who pass it around, and they love to just stir up the flames, you know, fan the flames. It's concerning where America's heading. So I really, really think the answer to this is that moderates, centrists, as I would say, they really, really get vocal on this and say, look, we can accept that we've got problems in society. We need to address this. But let's not shame an entire demographic. And I actually think Barack Obama, now some right wingers might disagree with this, I think sometimes he touched the right note where he was talking about injustices that needed to be addressed, but he was also actually quite careful not to polarize entire communities either. I actually think Obama was a lot more conciliatory than either Donald Trump or the woke left is today. That's not to say Obama was completely in the middle. He was probably more to the left. But, you know, I just think that people need to just step back a little bit and think, well, what do we know about this case? What are the facts in this case? And maybe there has been an injustice, in which case it has to be addressed. I think that when Derek Chauvin was found guilty, that was right, and I think it's justified that he was. But had he not been found guilty, there almost certainly would have been riots. That's an unacceptable situation whereby you have anarchy reigning in society. I mean, the unrest last year, the violence last year, I believe 30 people died. Um, the way the media covers these things, you know, contrast their coverage of that violence versus the violence at Capitol Hill. People look at the stuff, they look at double standards. So, anyway, I'll get off my pulpit now, but I just think it's so, so important that America moves on. There are deep wounds from the past, and there's no erasing of history. I think history has to be taught. But I think that if you want to constantly open up old wounds just for the sake of it, to say that your people were kept down, or to be defensive as well, it's not going to help anyone. And to look at every single, you know, if you get to the point where you cannot communicate with someone without the other person accusing you of having white privilege or whatever it may be, then sadly, nothing, you know, there's going to be no bridges. If you go around trying to shame people, you're not going to build bridges. But likewise, if you go around denying the obvious, that's not going to build bridges either. I really, really, really hope that American moderates can raise their voice, and the decent majority will prevail. Because I think there's extremes on the right and the left, and unfortunately, they're very vocal, very determined. The same applies on this side of the Atlantic. Most people, you know, they're not racist today. I think Britain, we have moved on so much, but the whole purification campaign last year, let's drag down statues, it was stepping back. That wasn't changing anything. It wasn't a case of acknowledging history. It was a case of a sort of attempt at a cultural revolution, um, which we know how that worked out in China. Mass chaos. bloodshed. And I'm not suggesting that it'll be the same thing here, but I just believe very, very firmly that the reasonable, decent, common sense majority has to prevail, has to raise their voices. Don't ignore injustice, but also don't fan the flames unnecessarily. Thanks for watching. My mouse is skipping today, so there we go.